So today's panel is devoted to basically the implications politically of the COVID-19 pandemic for politics in Eurasia and kind of the interactions between political systems, political regimes, and politics in the region, including how these things impact the disease itself, how effective the regimes have been developing. So I will, rather than just read out the whole list of presenters today, I will introduce people one by one as they speak. And I will note, though, that the order will be, first of all, Mariya, Omelicheva, and Larry Markowitz. And then we'll move to Ekaterina Schulmann, then Yulia Nikitina, and then Robert Orttung. So first of all, I'll turn to Mariya and Larry. Mariya is a professor of science at the National War College at the National Defense University. Larry is professor of political science at Rowan University. The title of their presentation is Securitization of COVID-19 and Security and Authoritarian Regimes, a case study of Central Asia. So we've asked each presentation to keep it to about 10 minutes, and that'll leave us plenty of time for discussion. So thank you, and I look forward to the discussion, your questions, which you can offer through the chat mechanism or question and answer mechanism on WebEx.
Thank you so much for this introduction. I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint, and I hope that you will see it promptly on your screens. Yay! Okay. So since we have so little time for the presentation, I'm going to jump right in, but please let me know if you cannot see my slides. Okay. All right. So recent months have seen quite a surge of interest in how governments communicate about and respond to COVID. And when it comes to authoritarian regimes like those in Central Asia, experts have rightly focused on highlighting the different kinds of human rights abuses as well as excesses in their responses to the pandemic. But Larry and I, we kind of looked at those governments, and we thought that historically these governments have dealt with national security threats much more assertively, and regimes could have done much more, but they did not. Okay, so we decided to apply the framework of securitization to examine how they've talked about the official discourses as well as responses to COVID-19. And we asked, what explains both the variation as well as the limited securitization of the virus across the Central Asian countries? And very, very briefly to illustrate this point in variation. So if we look at Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan, they kind of acknowledge the risk very early, and then they swiftly introduce states of emergency and lockdowns following the discovery of the first cases of COVID. In Kazakhstan, though, the government has sort of interspersed its securitization moves with the desecuritization moves, effectively reducing the urgency of the situation. The Kyrgyz authorities really did poorly as far as communications about COVID are concerned. So their communications were either non-existent or in disarray. And both Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan kind of discursively desecuritized COVID in advance of the lifting restrictions, and only Uzbekistan remained sort of steadfast in applying them for some time. And as we know, Tajikistan for the longest denied the threat altogether, and only much later and under some international pressure began quickly securitize it. Okay, so again, I can talk about the specific securitization and desecuritization moves, examples of those in the Q&A, but now I move to the argument in a nutshell. So we think about securitization as a process of creating legitimacy for enforcing extraordinary measures to counter the threat. Successful securitization, however, requires a measure of legitimacy to begin with. So the governments or other actors that securitize the threat, they have to go into this process with some measure of legitimacy. And if a regime is insecure, that is lacks legitimacy, it is less likely to securitize the issue and more likely to suffer the consequences of unsuccessful securitization. I'm going to leave the discussion of kind of normative aspects of securitization to Q&A. Again, for the sake of kind of having this presentation succinct. So this assumption is very important that preventive measures are preferred to the reactive ones, but when states do face the threat of highly communicable disease with pernicious consequences, securitization is preferred to desecuritization. And as all of you know, legitimacy itself is a very broad and contested term. So we think of legitimacy as a construct, and we argue that in the context of authoritarian regimes, this construct is often based on the government's performance, also known as the performance legitimacy. So the government's alleged success in providing citizens with welfare, ensuring public order and security, and promoting economic growth are the basis of legitimacy in those regimes. So to paraphrase our argument then, we expect that Central Asian governments that lack performance legitimacy and experiencing some internal threats will be more reluctant to securitize COVID-19. So let me talk a little bit about the cases that we looked at. So Kazakhstan. So on the one hand, a lot of government legitimacy, it came into the process of securitizing COVID with lots of government legitimacy, but it was tied to the first president, Nazarbayev. It had economic capacity, but Tokayev, the current president, he frequently referenced all that economic powerhouse that Nazarbayev built, but again, it's linked to Nazarbayev's legitimacy, not his own. And politically, the situation was very uncertain, with speculations as to who exactly pulled the strings for all the decisions in the country. And at the beginning of the pandemic, Tokayev seemed to be a bit constrained and reticent to make bold securitization moves. And there were also signs of insubordination when the government created inconsistencies in communications regarding COVID. But over time, when Nazarbayev retreated in the background and then reportedly got ill with COVID, and on the background of the spiraling crisis, Tokayev carried out some personal changes, and then there were also changes to data collection methodology. And just realizing how precarious the situation has become for his regime, he launched another round of securitization. And then in Kyrgyzstan, so we would argue that Kyrgyzstan's regime of President Jeenbekov came to the situation with probably the lowest legitimacy. Our interlocutors from the country pointed out that the country lacked true leadership, with nobody in the government really willing to take on responsibility for leading the response to the pandemic. And probably out of the fear of being sacked and later prosecuted, like Atambayev. And you know that spring in Kyrgyzstan has been dubbed as the season of protests, with some turning violent. So this fear of public discontent compelled the Kyrgyz authorities to undermine the urgency of the situation to avoid creating panic, and also clamp down on the freedoms of information and investigative journalism. And we can talk about the role of upcoming elections, okay? Also, linked to legitimacy and the government's response and communications about the COVID. Okay, I'm gonna turn over to Larry. Larry, he's gonna talk about the cases of Uzbekistan and Tajikistan next.
Great. Thank you, Mariya. One of the major things that distinguishes Uzbekistan is that in 2016, it had a new leader with the death of Karimov, and President Shavkat Mirziyoyev has, among many of the things that he sort of changed or introduced to distinguish himself from Karimov, is putting forward the primacy or the main theme of technocratic governance. He's really kind of frontline this as a main feature of his time in office, and this is, among other things, this is one of the things that has really defined a lot of the response to COVID-19 in Uzbekistan, and it really has shaped. It led to a much more comprehensive response to COVID than in the other cases in Central Asia. Surprisingly so, if you think back to the Karimov era, this is a very different type of government. Whether it effectively is technocratic is a separate story, but it certainly frames itself and presents itself as a technocratic regime. It introduced a panoply of measures to address COVID, economic measures. Well, first it introduced an early state of emergency, an early shutdown. It moved very quickly in the middle of March. It also introduced a whole series of economic measures because it was very worried about food security and access to medical supplies. It then introduced a comprehensive set of health initiatives. It also sought to mobilize society. So, and then in addition, it certainly introduced a number of security measures. So it isn't a completely defanged response, but one of the key things that defines it is the complex response and the emphasis on the technocratic nature. One of the other surprising aspects of Uzbekistan's response, compared to if you have spent any time in Uzbekistan or sort of followed Uzbekistan during the Krymov era, there's usually, during that time, there was really one voice. But in response to COVID, we see credentialed experts, all sorts of ministers presenting different aspects of the state's response. So this is the defining feature in how Uzbekistan has addressed COVID. And one of the ways in which this relates to securitization is that it sort of has folded the security aspects of the state's response into this complex set of initiatives, and it has not cloaked or discussed the crisis in security terms. It's really discussed it mainly as a health issue, as a broader health problem. While it's taken certainly some punitive measures at times against society, it has not framed it in this way. So we believe that this is a case where securitization is fairly light, even I wouldn't say absent, but it's really quite minimal. And then in the case of Tajikistan, I think the defining feature is Imamali Rahman's personalistic rule, his use of corruption and personalistic rule to retain control over the country. At times, he's used targeted repression in the past. And a second defining feature that has sort of shaped Tajikistan's response to COVID is this legacy of relying on foreign assistance, not only to consolidate rule, but to enrich members of the regime. At least it is widely believed that this is the case. And so Tajikistan's response has been one of, as Mariya noted, kind of denial and delay. If you think about the response in two phases, phase one was in March and April, where it completely denied the presence of cases within the borders. It took actions to seal off the country, close down airports, introduced temperature screening at income for people coming into the country, but essentially introduced very few domestic controls. There was no stay-at-home orders. There was very few limits on public life. Navruz, the spring celebration, was held without restraint, so to speak, and there were large crowds gathering in the capital. Family gatherings were not restricted, and so forth. And the second phase is one that begins really in May and continues into August, where there's a recognition of the crisis, but an ad hoc and sporadic response. And some believers, I think I'm probably one of them, believe that this late response is largely due to the fact that on April 17th, Rahman had installed his son, or arranged for his son to become the chairman of the upper chamber in Parliament, which is sort of like a movement, and he had previously been the mayor of Dushanbe. So this is a position that really puts him in place to succeed his father. That's certainly not the only reason, but that is certainly one thing to keep in mind. The response after that, from May on, even as the number has increased, I'm coming up on time here, dramatically, the numbers increased, but the response was ad hoc and fairly sporadic. The last thing about Tajikistan I want to say is, in a sense, it has not really had a strong incentive to promote securitization and define the crisis as a security one, in part because it doesn't need to. It can continue to receive, and it has received, enormous foreign aid without having to project this issue as a security crisis, and it has done that in the past with terrorism and drug trafficking, and has benefited by getting security aid. It's also this foreign aid and this foreign assistance, if it continues, it could generate sort of like a moral hazard effect, which Mariya and I have discussed in the past, where there's a less of an incentive to really address the problem, since it continues to bring in enormous amounts of foreign aid. And the foreign aid is in the tens of millions of dollars, and it's not clear that that is really going anywhere where it should, because there's very limited response in terms of testing, tracing, and treatment. So those are the two cases. Let me say a word really fast about concluding, and then I'll hand it over. The two main points I want to emphasize here is that while we think that securitization is something that you would see in Central Asia, it varies from country to country. There's a lot of variation across countries. And the second point is that international and bilateral aid, as it's done in the past, doesn't really recognize that and continues to sort of send money in and send aid in without really recognizing these very important political and historical differences. I'll leave it at that. Thanks for the extra minute.
Okay, thank you very much, Larry Mariya. So next we will turn to Ekaterina Schulmann, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at the Moscow School of Social and Economic Sciences. The title of her presentation is Lawmaking in Times of Plague, How Russia Adopted New Restrictive Legislation During the COVID-19 Pandemic. And just before she speaks, let me just say, you probably already gathered, is we usually let all the presenters speak, and then we'll have a discussion of all the presentations together at the end. So Ekaterina, the floor is yours. If we have you.
Public administration, and this is connected to the topic of my presentation, because I would like to share with you some of our preliminary findings based on following the spring session of the State Duma in 2020, which was a historic session in many ways, both planned and unplanned, expectedly and unexpectedly. It started with the presidential address to the Federal Assembly, which announced a constitutional reform, a major rehauling of the Russian Constitution of 1983. And after this, the necessity to implement various and widespread anti-pandemic measures also shaped the course of this session. I think the results and the process show how legislative work, how the work of parliaments, even of parliaments and autocracies, lends itself to various political aims, not just those of the government or the presidential administration, but also various interest groups who use this opportunity of furthering their own agendas. Unlike many other parliaments of the world, the State Duma did not go online in its work. The deputies were present in the plenary hall, but there was no access for any outsiders to the State Duma. So the opportunities that I mentioned not just included the lack of public attention to the legislative process, because this public attention was elsewhere, but also there were no parliamentary correspondents, no external experts, no outsiders able to personally attend the plenary sessions and the meetings of Duma committees, and also to personally communicate with the deputies. Although I must say that the level of transparency in the work of the State Duma is quite high, so it's possible to follow the process online. But still, as we all know now by our own experience, nothing can quite substitute the opportunity to be present on the ground. So how did the State Duma work during this lengthy and quite full session? It started in the middle of January and continued till the end of July. During this time, the State Duma has adopted 312 new federal laws, which is a high but not a record-breaking result. The usual result of a plenary session, of the spring session, which is longer than the autumnal session, is between 200 and 400 new federal laws. The general number of bills considered was 620. What was unusual in the spring session is the high percentage of legislation introduced by the government, because usually the spring session, unlike the autumnal one, which is devoted to the budgetary process, is more the playground of deputies' creativity. So usually there's a high percentage of bills introduced by the State Duma deputies and the members of Federation Council. The bills considered and adopted during this session can be divided into various groups. As I have mentioned, the session started with the constitutional reform. So the State Duma had to consider the constitutional amendments themselves. And here it's quite interesting, I think, to note how the mode of introducing and considering these amendments matched the usual Duma practice of introducing the most important things during the second reading. As some of you may know, every bill in the Duma passes 3 stages. The first reading, which approves the general concept of the bill, the second reading, which introduces the amendments, and the third reading, which approves or disapproves in some cases the bill as a whole. So it has been a long-standing Duma practice when the initiators don't want too much public attention on something in their bill. They do not introduce it as a separate amendment to a federal law, but as an amendment during the second reading. This allows to shorten the process and also, as I said, to divert some part of the public attention. But here we saw this practice on a much larger political scale. The first wave of constitutional amendments, which was introduced by the president into the Duma on the 20th of January, concerned the composition of state bodies, some changes in the system of checks and balances, and did not, and it also contained some of these social amendments, which were, as we know, since the most popular according to polls, like regular indexation of state pensions and higher guaranteed salaries. Then came the second wave of amendments introduced during the second reading of this one constitutional bill, because officially all these numerous amendments, which increased the bulk of our constitution by 40%, were one amendment, one single bill. The second wave of amendments contained provisions that has since been called the biopolitical. Those that concerned the preservation of traditional families, the defense of children as the main one of the priorities of state policy, the mention of God, the mention of Russian people as a state building, state forming nation. These type of amendments which had an evident conservative slant and were, as I suspect, aimed at arousing some interest in the future voters, which was not who were not that interested in the first type of amendment, the checks and balances ones. And then came the third, the last and final amendment, that has since been called the grandmother's clause, the Tereshkova's amendment, the zeroing of presidential terms, which in hindsight now look like the main reason for the whole constitutional reform, although I, for one, do not think that this was an idea that originated from the start of this legislative campaign. So during the spring session, the State Duma had to consider and adopt those changes, but in this process, the role of Parliament was minor. Changes, the amendments themselves came from the president. Second reading amendments also came from the president or from the Constitutional Commission under the president. So there was not much discussion and not many changes introduced from within the State Duma. However, at the same time, since the end of February, the beginning of March, when the pandemic began to be officially recognized by the Russian state government and various bodies like the operative headquarters were formed by the government, or the special working group under the State Council was formed to react to the pandemic, then there began another wave of bills introduced mostly by the government and then by the deputies themselves that fall into two main categories. The first, the governmental bills, were necessary in order to ensure the economic and the monetary help distributed to counter the effects of the pandemic, or rather the effects of the lockdown. This second category, and here the initiative mostly came, as I said, from the deputies, were the restrictive legislation that made possible the administration of fines for breaking the so-called mode of high alert, the regime of higher security, also connected with the implementation of lockdown. Here, an interesting detail is the following. Although the changes implemented by the State Duma were, of course, introduced into the federal legislation, the main weight of the work of fining people for leaving their houses without electronic permits and the like fell to the codes of administrative offenses of the regions, not the federal, but the regional legislation. And this falls well within the mode of redistributing, well, I wouldn't say putting the blame on the regional governors, but trying to redistribute some of the responsibility for the evidently unpopular lockdown measures. Following this, or rather simultaneously with this, we saw a number of legislative initiatives that have no connection with the COVID-19 or the lockdown measures or the help for those suffering from these lockdown measures, but were the work of lobbyist groups, of interest groups using this situation. And this also, these lobbying bills can be divided into two parts. First, introduced by the groups of deputies from the majority fraction, from the United Russia fraction, and their colleagues from the Federation Council, there were the quite major reform introduced into our electoral legislation. As you may have heard, constitutional voting proceeded according to newly invented rules, the ad hoc rules that were not previously in our electoral legislation, but were introduced together with the constitutional amendments themselves. During May of this year, the State Duma, again, without attracting much public noise, and also using the second reading amendment rules, introduced the same type of changes into our regular electoral legislation, which rules over the usual elections, not constitutional voting, which is a one-time event, but the regional elections, elections of governors, and elections of the parliamentary members. These measures included further restrictions against independent candidates, more strict rules for collection of signatures that the independent candidates, non-party candidates, need to collect in order to be registered. Also, limitations of the right to be elected for a much larger number of people who had been prosecuted according to a long list of criminal code articles. Previously, this list was much shorter and included, well, other types of, some types of violent crime. And now there's introduced a list of articles for political crimes, like breaking the rules for mass rallies and meetings, or falling into some extremist crime for which there's quite a number of articles in our criminal code. These changes also introduced preliminary voting during days preceding the actual voting day, which is the measure adopted quite a few years ago in Belarus. We in Russia saw it for the first time during constitutional voting. Now these 3 days, in constitutional voting it was 7 days, now we'll have 3 days voting during all of our elections, and this of course creates a ground for falsifications because the ballots remain during nights and days without supervision, and or under the supervisions of the same heads of electoral commissions who are the parties most interested in carrying out the work of falsification. That was the reform that attracted some public attention, but unfortunately too late. And this is where the factor of the absence of parliamentary correspondence played its role. It's extremely difficult to recognize what this or that bill is about unless you are in the Duma. They all have these vague sounding names, like the amendments introducing changes to certain bills, certain laws of the Russian Federation. And this is especially true if the main thing, the gist of the change is introduced as an amendment during the second reading. So one last category that I must mention, and this is directly about the lobbying efforts. But a number of amendments were introduced into the ecological legislation, and these were carried in the clearly and evidently in the interest of developers and builders. Most of these changes make it easier to appropriate land in the cities for the purposes of buildings. It also lowers restrictive barriers for the building of ecologically dangerous plants, including waste incineration plants. There's, as you may know, quite a program for building a number of these plants in Russia, and whenever this happens, it usually forms a reason for protests among the local residents, because people don't like the idea of waste incineration plant being built in their backyard. And so the lobbying community of developers and builders, which is an extremely influential interest groups, and as you may know, it is very well presented in the composition of the new government, because we also have the new government since January, so many changes in this year. And so they used also this time slot when public attention and expert attention and media attention was elsewhere to introduce those measures which will allow them easier access to municipal land, easier ways to demolish buildings in the cities, and again, less restrictions and less ecological expertise for the building of waste incineration plants. This is my, I'm afraid, rather sad conclusion of the results of the spring session of 2020. What I think this whole means politically is that non-democratic parliaments also have their own agendas and their own interests to pursue, but the difference with the parliaments in democracies is perhaps that they don't have the connection with the voters, which could restrict the activities of lobbying groups and the groups of interest.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So next we have Yulia Nikitina, who is Associate Professor of World Politics at MGIMO, Moscow State Institute of International Relations. The title of her presentation is State Capacity and Political Culture as Parameters for the Analysis of Quality of Governance in Times of COVID-19, Comparative Analysis of National Models. So, Yulia, there's yours.
Thank you, Henry. Well, now hopefully you see my presentation, right? Do you see it? Okay, so can you hear me and see my presentation, just to be sure?
Yep, can hear you
okay,
and see the presentation and see you. Yep.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so I changed the title a little bit to avoid spoilers, because Henry, indeed, that was my first title, where I explained that the state capacity and political culture do explain what's happening across Eurasia. So let me explain why I believe so. Okay, so what happens? And generally, I suggest that we look back at the financial crisis of 2008. And as you might remember, actually, most of the debates were about Russian and Chinese models of reacting to this crisis, authoritarian capitalism, and so on, and potential efficiency of this model of this type of reaction. And generally, when we analyze the reactions to COVID-19 across Eurasia, across different regions of the world, it seems that we tend to explain it with the type of political regime, although that if we look at different cases, different models of responses across Western democratic countries and non-democratic countries, it will not be that easy to explain it why this binary choice like democracy, non-democracy. For example, if we look at some cases in Eurasia, Georgia and Kyrgyzstan introduced such a measure as curfew. A state of emergency was introduced by Armenia, Moldova, only the healthcare sphere. In Ukraine, we saw public transport shut down. But in other countries, surprisingly, we had some moderate restrictions, like no curfews, no state of emergency in Azerbaijan or Kazakhstan, no lockdown at all in Belarus. Thus, well, the question is how to explain that. I thought that here the concept of state capacity might be helpful. Francis Fukuyama introduced this concept in 2013, that we need to rely on this concept of state capacity in addition to democratic accountability and the rule of law. And starting from March 2020, Fukuyama published a number of articles in different leading journals on state capacity and democracy and coronavirus. But does it help in our explanations? Now, me and my colleague at Juneau University, Igor Okhnev, who's also a member of Honors Eurasia, and Ekaterina, we are working on the research COVID-19 as a stress test for Eurasian integration. And as part of this research, Igor Okhnev made this calculation. He took some 68 development indicators, including like innovation index, political rights, exactly to test whether state capacity matters. He compared all those parameters for correlation, and the result was that no correlation was found, surprisingly, not surprisingly. So what can we do about that? And my explanation is that actually we should think here not so much about the state capacity, but more what is the subject of the social contract in each case. For example, let's take Belarus, a very important case now. What did Lukashenko promise to his society, to the Belarusian society? He promised no shocks. In the 90s, like our country will not undergo all those economic shocks that Russia went through and so on. Here again, during the COVID-19 crisis, Lukashenko didn't introduce any lockdown and strict measures exactly to support the social contract, like no shocks for the Belarusian population. So that's the explanation for the reaction in Belarus, for the Belarusian strategies dealing with COVID-19. In countries like Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, and Ukraine, which are more democratic from the Western perceptions, those countries introduce stricter measures. What's the explanation? And my understanding is that actually from the perception of the populations of those countries, those are governments with low state capacity. And the social contract in those countries is that the governments promised to improve state capacity. And that is exactly why they introduced stricter measures in comparison to other regimes which were analyzed as non-democratic ones. And now I need the collective wisdom of Honors Eurasia to generalize about this group, because it was the most difficult part for me. My explanation is mostly that countries like Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Russia, the ones that you see on this slide, there is no need to prove the state capacity to the population. On the other hand, we still do see some variations. And the first presentation and Ekaterina's presentation proved that that in case of, say, Uzbekistan, there was a difference. So Russia probably differs. I would like very much to discuss this group of countries with our expert community to see whether we can find some generalizations or explanations for that. And I believe that an important factor in intervening variable which should be analyzed as well is the political culture. And this saying for sure that the severities of laws in Russia or everywhere across Eurasia probably is mitigated by the fact that obeying them is optional. So my conclusions are as follows. If we want to explain the variation in anti-epidemic measures across Eurasia, the explanation would not be the regime type, democratic, non-democratic, and not the state capacity per se, because we checked for it, and there are a lot of similarities in the state capacity, but it's more about the perception of the state capacity by the societies, by the population of a certain country, and the subject of the social contract, what the social contract is about. Is it about shocks, economic shocks, or migrants, or something else? And political culture should be also taken into consideration. Thank you. I'll stop here. So my presentation is more like hypothesis testing, and I would appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Yulia. So just before introducing Bob, I'll note that as soon as Bob presents, we'll start the question and answer period. So if you have questions or comments you'd like any of the speakers to react to, please forward those to the chat, and I'll be collecting them while Bob's speaking. So now we can turn to Robert Orttung, who is Research Professor of International Affairs here at George Washington University. His presentation is entitled COVID-19 in the Arctic. So Bob, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Henry. So I hope you can hear me and see my presentation.
Yeah, we do.
Okay, perfect. So I will continue our conversation by moving the topic north. We started in Central Asia, then all around Eurasia. Now I'd like to look at the Arctic. And I think first of all, to look at, in terms of the Arctic, what is the COVID-19 crisis for the state? And of course, obviously, we know it's a health crisis. We know it's an economic crisis. Those topics are well discussed, but and sort of following up on some of the themes that have already come up here, what it really means for the state is a communications crisis, because the state leaders, whether you're in a democratic or authoritarian system, want to communicate in a way so that they change the way people behave, get them to wear masks and socially distance. And that, of course, requires trust in the authorities or some form of legitimacy, as we heard earlier. And it also requires a need to be able to communicate across cultures. And by that, I mean, the government people need to be able to communicate with people in the private sector, as well as throughout the different multicultural elements of a society. So in the Arctic, that typically means between the settler community, people moving in, and the indigenous community who've been there for thousands of years. And it's also, the COVID is also a governance crisis for the state. And what I mean by that is looking at what kind of governance is involved. And so my research has actually been heavily focused on Alaska, which is not exactly in Eurasia, but it is the former part of Russia, so that sort of is connected there. And then I'll connect it back to Russia. But the idea, we've interviewed a lot of the city officials in Juneau, Alaska, and one of the key failings that they've identified is the need to have a blended, holistic approach in responding to the COVID crisis. And so, sort of being self-critical of their own actions, they haven't been able to achieve that. And what that means, in a sense, in sort of practical terms, would be, for example, if you want to reopen your schools in the fall, as we're seeing happening or not happening in different places, you really need to shut down the bars in advance. And so everything needs to be connected to everything else. And so there hasn't been that kind of planning, at least in the Alaska case. And so I'll look at that in a little more detail. And then just so quickly, what makes the Arctic a little bit different from the places we've been discussing so far is, of course, the extreme cold, the rapidly changing climate, But what's crucial here for COVID is the remote and isolated locations. And so many of these places are, of course, far away from the rest of developed Eurasia or developed North America or Europe. You have relatively small populations and therefore fewer facilities, fewer medical hospitals and ways to deal with the crisis if it does come to your town. And of course, everything in the economy is based on resource extraction, whether that's oil and gas or fishing or mining. So, and that's true all through the Arctic, whether you're in Eurasia or other parts of the Arctic. So basically, if we look at Alaska's strategy, in terms of COVID, it was keep the virus out, minimize the number of outsiders who are coming in and bringing the disease to the local population, conserve hospital resources so that you can use them if you do have cases. And in the case of Alaska, obviously in the federal system in the US and in Russia, we had the same problem where the federal government basically punted responsibility down to the regional level or down to the local level. And in Alaska, the governor is quite right wing, but nevertheless, he actually listened to the medical advice. And so medical advice was prioritized over the politics. And so the strategy was relatively successful, but now you're starting to see a lot more cases coming in. And so, and the problem for the Arctic is really these large plants where you're either processing seafood or you're mining for oil and gas and other things. So you have lots of people working in very concentrated areas, and that's a place where the disease starts to spread around. But in the case of Alaska, you have that problem. The disease has been most prevalent in these factories like seafood processing plants. But in the case of Alaska, it actually came from the city and was transferred, through people going to bars to those plants. And then it started to really metastasize. So let's look a little bit what's going on in Russia. And so like Yulia, I have a big project where we have 128 indicators looking at 46 Arctic cities. And so one of our indicators is the number of physicians per 100,000 population. And the Russian Arctic cities are on the right with the red lines, and the non-Russian Arctic cities, so in Scandinavia and North America, are on the left. And you can see, generally speaking, Russia has a lot more doctors for the population than the other Arctic cities, and so presumably has more capacity to deal with the disease. Another difference between the Russian Arctic and Western Arctic is the density of cities. And so if you look at these satellite photographs on the left, for example, at the top is Arkhangelsk. It's a very highly concentrated, densely populated urban area, and a city of approximately the same size, about 300,000 people plus or minus. In Anchorage, Alaska, it's a typical American suburban style of development where houses are spread out and there's a lot of space between them. So in terms of sustainability, for example, the Russian city is a much better model. Things are closer together. You don't have to drive a car around. Your work is near your home, and you can find entertainment nearby. It's more walkable. The American city is much more resource wasteful. People burn a lot more energy per capita, that kind of thing. But in the case of COVID, maybe it would be better to have that more spread out situation. And you can see it applies in the lower pictures to small cities. The small ones in Alaska, in Russia, Anadyr is much more compact than in Canada's Yellowknife. But like Yulia, we found that none of these factors really mattered that much in terms of the response. Let's see if I can advance the slide. And so in the Russian case, in the Russian Arctic, the real number of cases came through the large resource development sites. And so here in Velikamenka, there was a large number of cases. And if you look at the way the local authorities communicated about this, so I want to focus on communications and governance, I suggested that was the key. There was actually, regardless of whether it's a democratic or an authoritarian system, there was actually on the local level quite good communication. You can go on the website and it's updated daily and see, for example, here on the left, the number of cases that were involved in the natural resource development site, the overall number of cases in Murmansk Oblast, and then down here, I think that's number of deaths. It's a rather strange way of saying it, but so there is quite good communications from the authorities. They're putting the information out there, and it seems like a reasonable way, easy to understand if you want to go look for it. And we see that the city manager of Murmansk on his personal Facebook page is even wearing a mask. So, he's trying to, through his own communications, present, model good behavior. And this is what it looks like in Alaska. It's very similar information, the number of cases, the number of dead, number of new cases recently, which was also there in sort of, a little more graphic interface, but basically the same idea. They have a color coding system to show that, sort of in a yellow situation with moderate danger, potentially, a red would be extreme danger, green is little danger. So in both systems, you see very good communications. And then in terms of governance, this is where things, I think, fall apart really on both sides. In Juneau, you have a very concentrated form of government where the city actually owns the local hospital, the local airport, and controls the schools. But as I mentioned before, there's not really been a comprehensive response to the crisis, although there's been a very good response. So in that system, you have a weak mayor, a strong city manager, and a 9-member city council. And then the state, of course, is separate. So there's not great communication between the local level and the state level. In Russia, in Murmansk, for example, you also have a strong city manager who's basically appointed by the governor, a weak mayor, who's elected, and a 30-member city council. And so looking at the Russian system in contrast, you could see that it's a little more coherently put together with the strong link between the governor and then the city manager, and that could help develop a more comprehensive policy. But I'm not sure, and this is where I would need a little more research on the ground in Murmansk to figure out if that's been a comprehensive policy that takes into account all the different parts of society or not. And then, like Ekaterina, I kind of come to the conclusion that representation suffers in this kind of system because it's more centralized, and you don't have the kind of input from the public that you need. And so that becomes more complicated. Like in the case of Alaska, city manager complains that there's probably too many members on the city council and they're not working together, and that the lack of interaction is actually exacerbated by the need to do everything on Zoom because you lack that personal connection in order to facilitate coalition building and sort of consensus management. So I can imagine what it's like on the 30-member city council. And then finally, in looking at the Arctic, we need to pay attention to the indigenous population. And then what's happening there, sort of out in the hinterland from the cities, is quite different. And here, both in Alaska and in Russia, the indigenous groups frequently talk about, their elders and the memories of the 1918 Spanish flu and how that had a huge impact on local populations. That they feel vulnerable due to their extreme remoteness, even more remote than the Arctic cities, and then limited access to information. And but again, their solution is similar to the city solution, which is to seek isolation from the settler communities, and so try and live off the land and avoid contact with the urban population as much as possible. But that's still creating some economic difficulty for them. So let me leave it there, and I look forward to our discussion of all these issues.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob, and to all the other speakers for very interesting presentations. I could see a number of common threads throughout them. I mean, maybe one of the bigger threads is just a tension between the drivers of policy making and just the difficulties and challenges that states face in dealing with a crisis like this, as well as political considerations. So it's all how these interact together. So maybe if I could just start out by asking the panelists to kind of respond directly to a question related to that. if you could maybe just keep your answer, just give like a 1 or 2 minute answer, 2 minutes at most, so we have time for other questions, certainly. Basically to understand what's going on in the region, based on what we've seen on the countries that you've studied, the subjects that you've studied, to what extent should we assume post-Soviet countries, at least the ones you study, are really seeking to combat the virus, and they're primarily just wrestling with constraints of culture, capacity, climate, legitimacy, for whatever reason, they may have some kind of incentive to really do their best to try and tackle this thing. And to what extent should we assume that they're using the virus to augment their own power, in a very cynical way? And so, how much are these things in tension? So maybe if we could just go quickly through the original order, and then I'll come back with some specific questions to individual panelists. So maybe let's start with Mariya and/or Larry.
Oh my goodness, very good question. And I think I would kind of rephrase it because definitely, there is a pool of culture and capacity and institutional path dependency. You can see it across the post-Soviet space. The question is to what extent? I mean, because in some contexts we observe it much more, in others a little bit less. And then another caveat is that we have a tendency to think about those states implicitly like unitary, right? Even, they are authoritarian regimes. There is kind of this command control structure with, executive at the top. But this is not what I see even in Central Asia, where, there are all these agencies within the government that are competing, and some of them are using virus to their advantage, to their benefit. And of course, we've seen examples of the governments themselves. So I think, but it's very, very important to separate, kind of that an assumption that this kind of the exploitation of virus is done in some kind of a centralized manner versus, other kinds of behaviors, the exploitation of virus by other people and agencies within the government. So there are all these kind of different layers and complexities that are, I think, better to think about as empirical questions rather than make assumptions that it's either like one way or another. So I'm not really answering the question that, given that you only gave me 2 minutes, but rather suggesting to think in terms of more nuance rather than, it's all about culture or it's all about capacity, and all these governments, all they want to do is to take advantage of the virus for their benefits. Over.
I would just add that in the case of Uzbekistan, it's interesting because that's a case where you could argue it's cynically using the virus, but to promote its technocratic image, but yet that is effectively responding to the virus. So in a way, it's sort of like a mixing of the two. And to go back to the other case that I was looking at is Tajikistan. Sometimes I honestly think that Tajikistan, they just like try to think of ways to put out crazy statements to get more foreign aid. I mean, when Tajikistan's leader says that Tajiks don't get coronavirus because they keep clean houses, I think they, some part of me thinks they just do that, like, and they envision they're going to get another $10 million in aid after they make a statement like that, because it makes no sense. Why would someone even say that? So that does lead me to think there is some manipulation of the crisis, yes.
Ekaterina?
Yeah, here I am. Thank you. In case of Russia, I think, like my colleagues, in case of other countries, it's a little bit of both. Usually the autocratic regimes or the so-called informational autocracies deal with threats of their own invention, which they are extremely successful in combating. But when the pandemic struck, they actually met the challenge that had to be reacted to in some rational way. They had to deliver, to do something about it. And I'm the one to always give its due to the efficiency of Russian bureaucracy. And during the pandemic, I must say that at least no managerial collapse happened. We kind of struggled through with the help of some rigging of statistics, with the help of some propaganda, but also using some genuine measures, restrictions here, monetary aid there. And among this lump of legislation that I've tried to describe during the 8 minutes allotted to me. Some were, again, genuinely, rationally necessary legislative measures. But we also saw during the same stretch of time an unprecedented attempt to conservate the current political model, the zeroing of presidential term, the rewriting of the constitution, and the major overhaul of electoral legislation, which more or less distorts the last remaining feedback channel between the society and the power, between the electorate and the elected. So we do have both. I think that on the whole, the system would prefer that no coronavirus happened, because they had their own plan of constitutional reform, voting on April 22, parade with international presence on May 8th, 9th. So this whole celebration schedule was already in place, but then the unexpected happened. But the system managed, I think, both to react to it in such a way as to at least present an image of state efficiency, and also to use it for their own ends of, well, they didn't strengthen the vertical of power this time, they rather submitted to de facto federalization, but they certainly managed to rewrite a lot of political and electoral legislation in their own favor.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. Yulia.
Well, I can just add that in my opinion, we tend to overestimate the influence of the COVID-19 pandemics over different spheres of life, while it just highlights the already existing problems. So that's why I agree absolutely with my colleagues that here it's a little bit of everything, both propaganda and genuine attempts to deal with the corona crisis. So, well, I will try to answer some other questions.
Okay, Bob?
Yeah, I would agree that the COVID is really nothing new, so we can easily go back to the Bible, like the book of Ecclesiastes, which tells us there's nothing new under the sun. And so what we're seeing politicians doing is taking credit, as they're always trying to take credit. And so in this case, the idea is to take credit for a competent response to the crisis. And so just focusing on my theme of communications, like in Alaska, we see the city manager became very popular in the population by doing fireside chats, little radio broadcasts every morning. He would give commentary what's going on. We've seen that with the New York governor, for example. Cuomo became very famous for that, and I think in Moscow you have the same situation. And I think in the Russian archive we see, like in Murmansk, I know less about the radio broadcast, but the social media presence of the local politicians seems to be quite strong. And so it seems that since I've been paying attention over the last several years, United Russia seems to have really understood the idea that you need to communicate everything on social media these days, and that's the way to get it out. And so they seem to be doing a very effective job of showing their competence, showing up at different sites, and showing that they're involved and taking action, and through that kind of building up a legitimacy. So it's the same old thing in politics, but in this new COVID context.
Okay, great. So I'll kind of start relaying some questions that came to individual speakers. So if you have other questions, please go ahead and relay them through the chat function on WebEx. First one is to Mariya and Larry, and that is, what do you mean by security measures? And so basically, and the kind of, and I think the request is for a little more explication of the logic there. Why would we expect Central Asian regimes to be emphasizing security aspects of this more than health or social policy concerns?
So this is kind of based on our, previous work in Central Asia and reading into the kind of history of responses, whether, we talk about terrorism, Islam, organized crime. So these governments have really, if they perceive something as a threat, they would talk about it in kind of an existential terms and use state, nation as sort of like the referent object, which are much stronger referent objects than calling health security kind of as a referent object or population, right? And so it's kind of in part in the past they've done that repeatedly and quite successfully, right? So that is one part, and so with regard to security measures, I mean, but they have relied extensively on the security apparatuses of this republic. So, Kazakhstan have pulled in the military and actually recently introduced some legislation to their state of emergency law that allows the military to play an active part in enforcing various measures, including those related to countering COVID-19. So military plays a role, security services play a role, very, very extensive. So police is a part of the Ministry of Interior. It's an agency that carry weapons, carry arms. It's also a security agency. So a lot of the things that they've done with regard to COVID, it does include the utilization of the kind of security measures that they would put towards addressing other types of security threats to the government, to the state, to the nation. Number one, and number two, it's interesting that it's kind of the old guards, including Nazarbayev himself, in his very rare statements, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, he tried to use the language that he traditionally used when he was the president, when he talked about the threat of radical Islam. So he was the one who tried to link the threat of the pandemic to the threat of the very survival of the state. But kind of the governments who've been in power for like 1 or 2 years, they're really reticent to use that language. So I'll keep it short. I'll let Larry to chime in if he wishes. Over.
Thanks. I'll be very quick. There were specific policies that these countries implemented that would definitely count as much more security focused. Tajikistan imposed fines on people that contract the disease and spread it. Uzbekistan marshaled about 3,000 security force members to monitor populations that were quarantined and so forth and so forth. We thought that we started with the premise that there would be a tendency in Central Asia for a securitization or an emphasis of framing this as a security issue, because that's what many of the regimes had done to problems that had preceded. And that's what I think the point that Mariya made. So I think it raises a broader question, not just for Central Asia, but more generally, like how is COVID different from other kinds of transnational dangers or threats or problems, like the ones that Mariya noted? To what extent is it more difficult or less difficult to kind of frame in a particular way that offsets responsibility and gives the regime room to maneuver and minimize blame? It seems to me, without any kind of theoretical or conceptual framing, that this is a problem that is, you can kind of externalize it initially, but once it's in your borders, it's really your problem. And it really requires a certain amount. That's why we're talking about state capacity and effective governance. And I think that it's very difficult to externalize this compared to other external threats or problems. I'll leave it at that. But I think it raises that nice, interesting, broader question.
Okay, next I have 2 questions for Yulia. The first is a clarification question. Is how do you determine the type of content of a social contract?
Okay, so I determined the social contract like in plain words, like the government promises something to the society, and the society expects something from the government. Like in Russia, we can formulate the social contracts in a way, something like the population says to the government, you don't interfere in our private life, and we don't interfere in the political processes, something like that, in a wide way. Or like in Belarus, Lukashenko promises no shocks, no economic shocks, no financial shocks for the population, and I remain in power.
Okay, great. And so the next question for Yulia is actually from Ekaterina. So since she's among the presenters, she can deliver it herself.
Yes, I have this question. You said that the type of reaction and the strictness of those reactions against the pandemic is not determined by the regime type. But from the countries you listed and the measures you described, I have the impression that those political models that need to project an impression of strength tend to adopt stricter restrictive measures like Ukraine or in Europe, France or Spain, while those countries that are perceived as more or less successful autocracies can take it easier like Russia because they do not need to show that they can be strongmen because they are strongmen already. Am I right in this impression? And if it is so, then there is a correlation between the regime type and the type of measures adopted and implemented.
Thank you, Ekaterina. Yeah, indeed, there should be some correlation because we're talking about state capacity, and state capacity is related to the type of regime somehow, but probably not in a very linear way. So that was originally the idea by Francis Fukuyama, that state capacity may be very high in some authoritarian countries, low in democratic countries, say like in Italy. We all saw that. So that's why I said that there is no correlation. But in case of Eurasia, probably this correlation is higher than in other parts of the world. I still have to measure that. My point is that if we analyze the variation in approaches in Eurasia, we probably shouldn't start only with the regime type. We should introduce some additional variables like social contract and so on and so forth.
So, but if this hypothesis is true, then we should expect the highest level of securitization from anocracies, from weaker regimes who would like to, again, to make a show of strength, rather than from the autocracies whom we expect it from.
Yeah, well, I mean, if I got you correctly, then yes, but probably shouldn't monopolize the discussion because there are some, I'm sure there are some more questions.
Yeah, yes, of course.
Okay, great. So I guess the next question kind of dovetails with something that I experienced sort of being in Moscow this past year. And so it's to Ekaterina. And the question is basically, you know, how has COVID overall impacted the legitimacy of the Moscow authorities in your view? You know, because on one hand, I mean, there was, I think one of the other speakers kind of alluded to or kind of compared Sobyanin to Mayor Cuomo in New York, right, kind of gaining authority. But on the other hand, you know, just my own observation, you know, like walking along the street, you know, it's just the total disregard of city orders. For, you know, wearing masks and things like that, even when it was officially required, you know, on the street. You know, and you could make an argument that maybe that wasn't really necessary to do those things, right? But it was still remarkable the kind of the divergence between what the city was telling people to do in a lot of ways and what they're actually doing. At least that was kind of my small observation, at least in the limited area where I was. So I wonder what your thoughts are on kind of, you know, what the crisis has done for, or, you know, how it's impacted, you know, Sobyanin and the Moscow mayor's office with respect to its standing in the population.
Well, here I must subscribe to the statement made by my colleagues that COVID has brought in nothing new. We have had the decline in the trust ratings of federal political authorities starting spring of 2018. And this process has not stopped during the pandemic, nor has it been accelerated to any great extent. Russia is one of the very few countries struck by the virus that has not experienced the rallying round the flag effect. almost every country has experienced it, even for a short time, but in Russia there has been no upsurge in trust or approval of the president. There has been as it turns out, a short rise in the approval of the regional authorities of the governments. We have seen it during spring and early summer, but the figures of July show that now the regional governors, they also experience the decline that is common to all our public political actors. Well, Sobyanin, again, according to the figures that we have been doing well in March, April, May, and then the decline started. I read it in the following way. This process of deterioration of trust, the erosion of core loyalty, is a, objectively determined process that cannot be significantly influenced by any outside events, even events of such magnitudes as COVID-19. Rather, whatever people see, they tend to interpret in the same way as they interpreted, for example, the pension age reform. So if they were prone to distrust or be disappointed with the central government, they will be disappointed by the anti-COVID measures. If they still retain their loyalty to the status quo, then they'll probably be more or less satisfied with the measures taken by the government. So there have been, it has not been a game-changing factor. I can't say that it had no impact, but the impact was exactly in the same direction as we've seen previously. It didn't change the trajectory of the transformation of public opinion and public attitudes in Russia.
Hey, great, thank you. So now I have a question for Bob, and that is, has work been interrupted on oil and gas platforms and fields in the Arctic? And there's a specific question about Novatek.
Right. So my sense is that the cases in the Novatek, which is the company operating the construction that I'm referring to, that was early on in the crisis, and as a function of the fly-in, fly-out workers who come from Central Asia. A lot of times they're from all over Russia, to that area, from all around the region, and so it was sort of an obvious place where you might expect to see an outbreak of COVID. But since then, they've got it under control, is my sense of that production continues, although I haven't followed this in great detail. In Alaska, it was different. You didn't have very many cases in the beginning, and it's only later on when they started allowing people to come in to the state that you started to see cases, although in those cases, the factories were very careful to make everyone quarantine for 2 weeks, and it was actually getting the disease from the local population. So for the Arctic, it's whether the disease is coming from the local population to the factories and to the development sites, or from the development sites to the local population. And so it seems in Russia, it was more a case of the latter, that it was coming from the development sites to the population, whereas in Alaska, it's been the other way around, at least from what I've seen in the data. So, but as far as I can tell, it hasn't really slowed down oil production. But obviously, the COVID crisis has created a lot of other problems in the oil and gas market, and that's probably much more influential than the disease itself.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so we have just a few minutes left before our time runs out. So I think I'll just relay the question that probably everybody can see from Mikhail Filipov, which is to all panelists, so presumably all who want to address it, which is, did the central government in Kazakhstan and Ukraine try to shift some responsibility and blame onto the regional governments, perhaps similarly to what we see in Russia? So let's just go in the order of the speakers there, and I think then that'll probably take us to the end, unless people are really brief. I
will be very brief. The short answer for Kazakhstan is yes. As a matter of fact, Tokayev came out very, very, very strongly, putting blame on Akims, so kind of the regional authorities, the governors, and on the public that was not heeding, especially the youngsters, the young public that was not heeding the government admonitions and advice on social distancing and mask wearing and whatnot. And that very strong, kind of atypical to how Takhayev talks in public, that very strong speech followed by a number of personal changes. So that was the first kind of major minor shakeup in the government that was noticed by analysts, and that included removal of some of the akim. So at least in the context of Kazakhstan, definitely so. Maybe on the lesser scale than in Russia, but it is being done. Thank you. Over.
So Larry, did you want to comment?
No, I don't have a comment on that. That's fine. Mariya covered.
Okay, Ekaterina?
I'll be even brief. I can't comment on Kazakhstan. I don't know enough about the internal regulations in this country.
Yulia?
Oh, no comment from me. Oh.
Okay, and Bob?
Yeah, well, I can comment on the U.S., but it just briefly, you know, it's one thing what the federal government does in terms of the COVID policy. Those are really, you know, unless there's a national mask mandate or something like that, where there's a very coherent policy. But the money to help people on the ground is coming from the federal government. And so despite sort of the chaos in terms of COVID response in the U.S. federal government, the money that Congress provided to the local cities and state governments and to the local companies was greatly appreciated. So I think that and it would be interesting to see how that plays out in Eurasia. You know, regardless of what the federal government is talking about with COVID, if they're providing money to help people who are losing their businesses or you know, losing their jobs and that kind of thing, that would have a very strong impact on the way that the federal government is perceived. And so I think we kind of have this bifurcation in the U.S. where it seems like chaos in terms of actual COVID policy, but in terms of the economic response, that was considered quite effective.
Henry, can I chime in a little bit?
Sure.
So even though the question was about Kazakhstan, but I want to bring an example of Kyrgyzstan because I think it speaks to a broader theme of kind of policy emulation or responses emulation. So Kyrgyzstan in particular kind of followed Kazakhstan, but also Russia in you know, the kind of the legislative act, particularly the so-called internet gag law that they passed through the parliament very, very quickly during the lockdown. And then Kazakhstan was the first country in the world that reintroduced like full-blown lockdown, a little bit fewer restrictions, but nevertheless, like at the beginning of July. And then Kyrgyzstan considered that, particularly when they experienced all that shame when Jeenbekov's group that traveled to Russia for the Victory Day parade was not allowed in. Why? Because he had members of his administration falling sick left and right, diagnosed with COVID. You know, the judges of Supreme Court, the parliamentarians. I mean, so so they began seriously considering to reimpose restrictions and a quarantine, but they didn't. But what Jeenbekov did, however, he said, well, let local governments do that and let local governments decide as to whether or not they want to reimpose restrictions and quarantine. And some of the local governments, instead of the central government, as Kazakhstan did, reimposed lockdowns locally. And I think this is done specifically because Jeenbekov and Social Democratic Party are really, really concerned about the upcoming parliamentary elections scheduled for October 4th. There was a strong push to postpone those elections because of the dire economic circumstances and whatnot, but they decided to proceed. So again, there are like some similarities that echo some of the processes in Russia and other contexts that, you know, that clearly are at play. And so there is kind of emulation and going on across contexts. Over.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're pretty much out of time. So let me conclude by thanking all of our participants for a really interesting conversation. And I will also call attention to, again, as I said at the beginning, this is the first of a series of Friday panels that we'll have at the same time. So if you want to be sure to get the mailings and just check out other things that Ponars Eurasia is doing, you can go to ponarseurasia.org. The next session will be on the theme of Black Lives Matter, Reverberations in Eurasia. And so we hope to see you there. And thank you once again to everybody. And we'll look forward to hopefully seeing you again next week.